A couple of lectures ago, we learned how we could process mouse button input in our Unity games. And in the previous lecture, we learned how powerful the input manager is. So in this lecture, we will convert our mouse button processing to use the input manager, more specifically a named input axis, for our mouse button processing instead. So let's go to Unity and do that. Recall that in our code from the previous lecture, we used input get mouse button down to find out whether the left mouse button was pressed. And while that worked great, and in some cases that might even be good enough, let's take advantage of the input manager in Unity to actually make this a named input axis instead. Here in the editor, the way we get to the input manager is by selecting Edit, Project Settings, Input. And over here in the inspector, it lists all our named input axes. And you might think, wow, that's horrible, there aren't any. But of course, we could just expand using that arrow, and we can see that we get 18 default input axes. To add one, we add one to the size. And what happens is, down at the bottom, it simply copies the bottom one down as an additional input axis. So I'm going to change the name of this input axis from cancel to change character. The positive button will be mouse 0. And we won't have an alt positive button at all. The input type is definitely a key or mouse button, so we're all set with the work we need to do in the input manager. Now we can go back to the script. So we know we want to get the named axis instead of calling get mouse button down. Let's go take a look at the scripting reference to see how we do that. Here in the input documentation, down in the methods, we see there is a getAxis method that returns the value of the virtual axis identified by axis name. So if we click on that, we see that we provide a string, the name of the axis that we want to get, and it returns a float. And it returns a floating point value, and if in fact we had both negative and positive inputs, it would give us a range from -1 to +1, but for us, all we care about is it greater than 0? Because we set the positive button to be mouse 0. So in our code, instead of calling the get mouse button down method, we will call the get axis method. And the name of the axis we selected was change character. And we will check to see if that input is greater than 0. And if the input on that axis is greater than 0, that means the left mouse button has been pressed. And so we have input on the axis, and we should change the character. So when we run our game, we have our character. Well, okay. So we are responding to input on the axis, but I imagine you can see that we're cycling through a number of characters there. Here's the issue. When we did get mouse button down, it only gave us a true on the first frame on which the left mouse button was depressed. Here, no matter how quickly I press the mouse button, it is detecting input on the change character axis for more than one frame. And so we're going to need to add some logic to make it so that it only responds to the first frame of input on that axis, but we'll do that in the next lecture, not in this one. We did, in fact, get the input axis working, and we're responding to input on that axis. We just have a little bit more processing to do before it's working the way we wanted it to behave. To recap, in this lecture, we converted our mouse button processing to use a named input axis, and we still have a little more work to do that's not working quite properly, and so we will fix that in the next lecture.